Hello, my name's Ajay and you're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Today we're delighted to welcome Mary Schweitzer on the show. Mary emigrated to Israel back in 1983 from Rochester, New York. She's been a volunteer with many peace and human rights organizations, including Gush Shalom, Peace Now, the Israeli AIDS Task Force, and Physicians for Human Rights. Currently, she's coordinating a special project for the Cooperative Agricultural Research and Development in Palestine, Jordan, and Israel. Mary, thank you so much for joining us on The Defining Moment.
It's good to be here.
Well, the topic today is the dignity of difference, or in fact, acknowledging the dignity of difference. Before we get into that, can you please share with us a defining moment from your life?
There have been many. I'm a very fortunate woman. But I think probably in the context of the conflict, one of the most defining moments for me was my first trip to Hebron, Khalil, after the beginning of this current intifada. I had not been into the West Bank for many years because with the first intifada, I had decided that if the people of Palestine don't want me there, that's their right. And I must acknowledge that right, beautiful as it is and as much as I love it. And I really stopped traveling there, not because I was afraid, but because I was acknowledging their right to say, this is mine and that's yours. And then the Intifada broke out, and I had an opportunity to go, and I was challenged by some Palestinian friends, come and see what it's like today. And I remember that it was a cold, wet, rainy day in December, and we made the trip from East Jerusalem on Palestinian buses, a trip which is 15 minutes, took us nearly 2 hours because we couldn't travel on the roads that I normally travel on in that region. And then we ultimately arrived at the closest place we could get. We had to get off the bus and walk across the street, and I didn't understand what was going on because what I saw in front of me was a maybe meter-high pile of dirt and rubble and large stones. And I saw people climbing over this. And I didn't understand why. We were walking on a road, but the road was entirely blocked. No cars could pass. And on the other side of this pile of rubble was a huge collection of taxis. Perhaps 20, 30 taxis were there, waiting on the other side. And again, rainy, cold, wet day. And I was climbing up over this roadblock together with the friends who were escorting me. And as I sort of reached nearly the top of it, an elderly Haji, an elderly Palestinian lady, slipped on the mud. And human being to human being, I reached out to catch her and break her fall. And I began to sort of weep inside of me. I thought, what a horrible thing, and how can anyone do this? And then I continued on, not really yet grasping what had happened to me. We came down the other side of this pile of rubble and approached a taxi and negotiated a taxi which could take us the remaining 10 kilometers from the road into the city of Hebron, al-Khalil. And shortly thereafter, I found myself in a car with two ladies dressed with hijab and a man in the front seat and the driver. And the man in the front seat turned to the two ladies and, well, first he turned to me and he said, I'm going to tell him. And I didn't grasp yet what he was going to tell them. And then he turned to the two ladies and said something in Arabic. And the only words I understood were Mary and Israeli. And I can't say I really was frightened, but I wasn't frightened, but I was shocked. You know, what's he doing? And yet I am Mary, and I am an Israeli. And these two ladies turned to me and spoke better Hebrew than I speak, and said to me that they were traveling also to Hebron al-Khalil, and then they said, Ahlan wa sahlan, welcome. And I began to cry in earnest. I could only turn my head away in shame. And when I thought about it afterwards, for many, many, many days afterwards, and eventually wrote a small piece about it and sent some of the photographs that I had taken on that day, I was astounded to what have we come, that it's such a beautiful land, a land with so much promise, with so many beautiful people, and we can't speak to one another, we're killing one another. Why? And at that point I set out really to try to discover why and to see if there was anything that I could do to make a difference. I guess that's probably in this Intifada one of the most defining moments.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about actually your experiences, having been in Israel since 1983 and having had, especially now, the possibility of going into Palestinian territories in your current role. Now, in all of those experiences, what has been the worst kind of suffering that you have witnessed in Palestine?
The theft of dignity, the theft of humanity, and if not the theft, then certainly the loss. To see people who have a living memory of their homes in Jaffa, in Haifa, even in Kfar Saba, where my home is today, and to see them today living in conditions where they need my help to bring them out of Ramallah to a doctor for eye surgery, or they need my assistance, my being a universal term, not me personally as Mary, but me and the organizations I work with, deliveries of the most basic food items, flour, sugar, oil, tea. This is terrible, terrible suffering, the more so if I'm the one who's inflicting it. Again, not me personally, but me in terms of the society which I've chosen to become a part of. This loss of who we are as human beings, the loss of our dignity as human beings, is a devastating thing. It's far worse than depression or illness. It's something which makes us begin to doubt our very humanness.
And how about for the Israelis? I mean, obviously being in Israel yourself since 1983, how's it been for them? What's the suffering from the other side, so to speak?
First of all, as a mother, I know that my children are expected to serve in an army. And armies are dangerous by their very nature, by their very definition. If you put a gun in someone's hand, it's an invitation to violence.
So it's a compulsory
it's compulsory military service, universal compulsory military service. Our army is called the Israel Defense Forces, and the concept of defense is one which I certainly understand the need for. The second equally important thing is the fear of when the buses explode, or walking past, just walking out of a restaurant where I know I was there 15 minutes ago and now it's rubble and many people are dead. This fear of unexplained, random violence at any moment, not perhaps so much as it may threaten me personally, but as it may threaten my children and my neighbors and my loved ones. And that's true whether I'm in the heart of Tel Aviv or whether I'm what today is on the other side of the wall. The violence is equally random, whether it's coming from an Israeli gun or whether it's coming from some form of Palestinian resistance.
And what is your opinion, or what are your thoughts about the wall itself? It's a recent, approach to keeping the peace. Is it working, or what are your thoughts?
Well, Ajay, I can't see anything about a wall that divides human beings as a peacekeeping item. It's simply not, and I was devastated by the thought of the wall, let alone its actual implementation. Recently, last Christmas, I was in Berlin, and the overwhelming thought when I was standing at Brandenburg Gate, I kept looking for some signs of the wall. And at some point, I turned to my hosts and I said, there's no indication that the wall was here. And it was only 1989 that the wall fell. My God, it gives me hope. Maybe this abomination that currently slices the lands of Palestine and Israel will someday be gone. I remember mid-January, 2 years ago, standing what is now west of the wall in Abu Dis as the last slab was lowered into place on another cold, rainy night. And it was actually there, lowered into place on the road, which is, according to tradition, Christian tradition, the road that Jesus took from the desert up to Jerusalem. The road that I had taken many times over the last 30 years from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea. And today, of course, it's in the heart of Al-Quds. It's East Jerusalem. And it was a devastating, isolated feeling. There I was watching this wall come down between me and many friends, people's whose homes I had been in, and people's whose celebrations, whose weddings and births and deaths I had shared. And we didn't always agree, and we do not always agree, about politics. Many Palestinian friends don't agree with me that as a Jew I have a right to live there. Many others agree with me that as a human being I certainly do have a right. And here was this slab of concrete coming down, closing off forever my access to those people and their access to most basic humanitarian rights, the hospital just up the street, the job that they've gone to all their life, the school that their children learn in, the access for an ambulance in case of an emergency. Not only the friendship and the families. The wall is anything but a peacekeeping item. We can't build peace by encouraging fear. We can only build peace by learning to respect one another and our differences.
So living in the midst of all this fear and this terror, this conflict that seems to be just never ending, what gives you hope?
Hope. I can't say I don't have hope, and certainly in a wonderful program such as yours that really is all about how do we find hope in the dark moments. I can't say that I've abandoned hope, although there are many, many very dark moments. What gives me hope is seeing a child looking excited, discovering something new, learning to dream again. I think one of the brightest moments that I like to cling to from the Palestinian side is a day that we took a group of Palestinian children from Abu Dis to the zoo in West Jerusalem. And once we finally got on the bus and finally began to travel, we came through a tunnel, and these children, 5 and 6 years old, had never been out of Abu Dis before because they were too small before the Intifada, and now most of the time it's closure. And they came to the tunnel in this road and they became very excited and screamed and yelled in excitement, "What is this? What is this? Where are we going?" And we explained that this is a tunnel built for cars to come through the mountain. And they were so excited. It was absolutely beautiful to see them. With Jewish children or Palestinian citizens in Israel, I don't know, their laughter on the seashore gives me hope. Because if we can create a society today that allows these children to make these discoveries together in the future and to share these discoveries with one another, then there's hope, however dark it might be, to keep on trying.
Now, Mary, more than most of us, you've had direct experience of these 3 different cultures, being born into an American Christian family and then converting to a Jewish faith, and obviously living where you are now, also experience of the Islamic culture. So why do you think it's been so difficult for the 3 Abrahamic faiths to unite?
You know, Ajay, when I chose Judaism, I chose it because it spoke to me particularly through the privilege and the obligation that it gave me as a human being. It gave me a set of rules that demanded of me respect of my fellow human being, not of my fellow Jew or my fellow Christian or my fellow Muslim, but of my fellow human being. And I think that's the part that still holds me today and still gives me the strength to continue with what I'm doing. Because what I've learned is as rooted in my faith, in Judaism, as my humanity is, my Muslim friends and my Christian friends are equally deeply rooted in their tradition, and they find their humanity and the strength for their humanity in that same tradition. So for me personally, these are all the same, and they're a wonderfully exciting opportunity for us to sit and talk. I remember a time in Belgium where I was traveling with a Palestinian activist, and we were speaking in various places, and one evening they put us up in a monastery, and we sat with Father Joe and Nafez and Mary, the Jew, the Christian, and the Muslim. And we sat until the sun came up, telling stories from the New Testament, from the Quran, from the Torah, sharing the similarities but also the differences. In the case of your question, I think too often as human beings we fear difference rather than learn to respect that difference and to be enriched by that difference. There's enough holy sites in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, for the entire world, and we can all take pleasure in them, and we can share in them, and we can be enriched by the different ways that each of us looks at them. But it's difficult if we're coming from a place of fear of, shall I say, starvation, fear of not enough. If we can learn to acknowledge the plenty, the glass half full, if you will, rather than the loss or the lack, then perhaps we can overcome that and become united in the fact that we share a common ancestor in Ibrahim.
Do you see Jerusalem, or the potential for Jerusalem to be perhaps some kind of international city with its own set of leaders from perhaps the three major faiths there? Do you see that as being the key to peace in the Middle East?
No, I don't. First of all, for me at least, religion should not be, it often is, but it should not be politics. Religion should be between us as individuals and as communities of individuals and our God, our one God, whom all three faiths share. To put a political solution on God makes no sense at all to me. God's not about politics. God's about, he or she, if you'll forgive me for saying so, is about learning to respect one another, learning to live together, learning that we do have everything we need to live a life of fulfillment, to adhere to our respective commandments. So no, I don't think that bringing in international people or religious leaders to draw artificial lines and say this is my property and this is your property will solve the problem. We need to develop a culture which understands that the treasures of our respective heritages are common treasures and require mutual respect and are there to be shared. Before the Intifada, one of my most delightful things to do was go to the old city of Jerusalem, climb to the Haram, or what I call the Temple Mount, to spend time talking to the ladies and the children inside the Golden Dome, to visit Al-Aqsa, and to know that in this very spot, 2,000 years ago, there was a temple. And 1,000 years before that, there was another set of places where human beings worshipped their respective gods. And I think that's a beautiful, magnificent thing. And therein, in the culture of plenty, of shared heritage, I see a solution that will bring peace, not in dividing and politics.
Why do you think Europe is not actually taking a more of a driving role in trying to create or trying to support the efforts to create peace in the Middle East?
Well, you know, the European community, its Jewish community was destroyed in the Second World War. And the American Jewish community is the one which today survives. Of course, the European Jewish community is growing today, but the awareness of the Jewish perspective on Israel is certainly much stronger in the United States, and lobbying and politics is what it is. As for the American role, I have to say I'm not particularly pleased with the American role. I think we could take a lesson from Europe. And perhaps part of the answer to your question lies in the reality that Europe, having suffered two devastating wars in 2 generations, have perhaps learned that war is not the solution. More violence will not bring an end to violence. Unfortunately, Condoleezza Rice, George Bush have proven over and over again that the United States hasn't yet learned that message. What's happening today in Iraq, what's happening today even in Israel and Palestine, largely comes from apparently a continued belief that force will bring us something. And I'm haunted both by what the United States is doing and also what Israel is doing. What's going to be the price of the use of so much unnecessary force? And perhaps the role that the European Union is able to play, is to help keep us aware that force is not the answer, and using their own history to make that happen, to demand accountability of governments and of people. It doesn't matter whether they're Palestinians or Syrians or Israelis, but to demand accountability of all of those governments in order to build a hope for a better future, in order to build a possibility for peace and coexistence.
So if force is not the solution, then what is? How do you dissolve the conflict? How do you purge all these years and years, in fact centuries, of resentment? How are you going to do that?
Well, we each have to find our own way, and I think Gandhi said, don't try to make a difference, try to be a difference. And it was hard for me to come to grips with that concept. But this is part of the reason why I do the work that I do today. I've learned that in bringing together Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian scientists and sharing each of us with the other what kind of work we're doing, what kind of problems we face in the laboratory, in the classroom, we first discover our basic equality. We have a common interest. And in the beginning, in these meetings, it's usually a case, that somebody in the room doesn't want to talk to someone else in the room because of histories. And usually it's not histories of themselves. These are young people, very often, 25, 30 years old. It's the histories that their parents suffered, that their grandparents suffered. And yet, in coming together and sharing, what we discover of one another is that those differences are very real and very important. Those pains, those agonies, that suffering is very real and very much a part of us. However, it doesn't keep us from becoming who we're intending to be. It helps to mold us, but it needs to become a basis for our trust, our taking a chance to take one more step, for us acknowledging that there's pain and suffering. It's part of the human reality. There's also hope and learning and growing and sharing to find a solution to some of that suffering. So what I did, together with a friend, a colleague, who happens to be a Palestinian, also a citizen of Israel, was we began to look for opportunities to bring people together this way. Inside Israel, indeed, the same thing has happened. I work with an organization called Sikui, whose goal, its driving modem is that we cannot ever have peace if we don't first have equality. So to bring about a situation in which we can speak to one another and live with one another and share with one another as equals will naturally bring about a situation where we have peace. because there's no need for use of violence and force between equal people. We can share.
Now that very much fits in today's theme, acknowledging the dignity of difference. What does that phrase mean to you?
I'm enriched by seeing, as I travel through the world, how very, very different people are. They speak different languages, they dress differently, they have different color hair and different color skin. And yet, the more I travel in the world, the more times I have the luxury, the privilege of sitting with someone whom I've never met before and talking with them, the more I discover how very much alike we are. We want security, we want to laugh, we want friends, we want a future for our children. We want to know that the sun will come up tomorrow, that we can get medical care when we need it. We want to live in security with one another. So what I'm impressed by when it comes to all of these differences, amazing differences in heritage, and yet we're all the same human beings. We have a shared motivation that gives us meaning for life. That, for me, is the dignity of difference. If we acknowledge that difference in each of us, then we can come to a place of great dignity and great sharing and great understanding.
And in order to, I guess, be able to appreciate the difference and acknowledge the dignity of difference, it takes the effort of getting to know the other. But there's also the aspect of getting to know really about yourself and taking time for self-reflection and understanding, well, where am I as a human being? Where do I stand? Where are my values? Where's my integrity? Are there mechanisms or ways of doing that that can also help someone like yourself to deal with the situation that you're in?
I think that perhaps I could answer your question by saying that first, to know myself, to discover who I am, to not be afraid of the painful moments when I discover, for example, that I have also played a role in the occupation, sometimes an unwitting role. But as we discover what that role is, then we must also consider, what can I do to correct it? God, by its very nature, is very forgiving. We have to learn to forgive one another. But most of all, we have to learn to forgive ourselves. Because only if we forgive ourselves for mistakes that we've made that we're unaware of or that we didn't realize, can we then move on genuinely to healing and to reaching out and to helping and to being the change that we want to see.
Now, we often hear about the activities of politicians and less so of people like yourself working with NGOs and peace organizations in the grassroots activity. But how about filmmakers or artists? Is there a generation of filmmakers that are helping this process of being able to acknowledge the difference and going through that self-reflection so that the internal peace can actually be achieved?
For me, most poignant and remarkable things that I've seen in this direction recently is a film that's been fairly recently released called Forgiveness by the director and writer Udi Aloni. You may know, the son of the famous human rights activist and former parliament member Shulamit Aloni. Udi's film, by its very title, Forgiveness, addresses the issue of what's involved in it. How do we know who we are as human beings, and when can we bring ourselves and that awareness into a situation that we have to address things, even if it's uncomfortable, and how can we change it?
Well, Mary, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you so much for bringing your compassion and your many years of experience to share with us on The Defining Moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you.
You've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. If you'd like to see more of our shows, we're on the web at www.definingmoment.eu. Thank you for watching, and we wish you all the best.